focused on that. Let me hit that. Going to be mostly focused on cannabis and cannabinoids. And then any questions that you have, I'm going to be happy to answer to the best of my ability. With that being said, let me advance my slide. There we go. With that being said, this is for informational purposes only, obviously not intended to be a substitute for medical advice. So make sure you're always seeking the advice of any of your healthcare providers on your medical team with any questions that you have regarding a medical condition or any treatment. And that was the boring part, I swear. So just to go over what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about the history and regulations of cannabis. We're going to be talking about the cannabis plant itself, as well as cannabinoids. Then we're going to speak a little bit about the therapeutic targets that things like CBD and THC focus on in the body, as well as some practical considerations. So maybe as you're thinking about maybe using a marijuana product for any reason, you can take some of these ideas back to your physician and have a full discussion with them. So as we're going through this, I want us all to be thinking about the question of, is cannabis a medicine? So the cannabis plant contains many molecules that we'll talk about in a little bit that can potentially improve the symptoms of a disease. But it's really important to understand that in the US, we have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which focuses on a lot of the scientific rigor, making sure that there actually is research and data out in order to classify something as a medicine. And so while there might be compounds and portions of the plant that can be useful to treat symptoms, making sure that we're thinking about what a medicine really is and what the scientific literature and the data really says. So to kick us off, let's talk about the history and regulation of cannabis. So medicinal cannabis and cannabis use has been recorded for over 5,000 years. Our earliest written document that was talking about cannabis was actually found in China in 2600 BC. That was talking about the medicinal properties of the plant. It moved through a number of different areas throughout the world. We have written literature and history that shows where these things were mentioned, where the cannabis was actually used. And then we noted things like cannabis discovered in an ancient tomb, where they were found in pipes or in burial chambers, noted the cannabis fruiting bodies or the flowers, which is where a lot of our cannabinoids come from. It was also recorded in the very first Arabic Materia Medica, which is one of our earliest medical documents, talking about what physicians were able to use for a number of different disease states. And then a little bit more recently, William O'Shaughnessy recorded its widespread use throughout Asia. So he was an Irish traveler who sort of just documented his travels, and he saw a lot of cannabis use throughout those countries. In 1851, the US Pharmacopoeia added it to its third edition, and the US Pharmacopoeia is essentially just a giant list of drugs that are available that may have a practical use. And then in 1899 AD, it was added to the Merck's manual describing its potential medical uses of cannabis. Then in the 20th century, things started to change a little bit. Cannabis was actually removed from the pharmacopoeias in the UK. It was in 1932, and it was removed in 1941 from the US. The Marijuana Tax Act, which was done in 1937, effectively prohibited any use of marijuana even before it was removed from the US Pharmacopoeia. And this is what really started a lot of the penal sanctions on possession and supply of marijuana. In 1961, we talked about the Single Convention of Narcotics in 1961 in the US and the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971 that said that there was no therapeutic benefit from cannabis. And then we had in 1970 the Controlled Substance Act. And the Controlled Substance Act is what gave us the controlled numbers that we have in the US. So we have controlled numbers from 1 through 5. And Schedule 1 is actually the area that has the highest potential for abuse, that has no accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety. But then we also have controlled substances like Controlled 2, 3, 4, and 5, which all decrease in their potential for abuse, but then do have an accepted medical use. So basically, marijuana was scheduled as something that is not useful and unsafe. And because cannabinoids are found in marijuana, all cannabinoids that were found in the plant were designated as Schedule 1 as well. This has changed in the 100 years. This has changed in the 50 years. I can't do math today. since then, but that's sort of where the starting point was in the mid 1900s. Finally, in 2018, we had the Farm Bill, also known as the Agricultural Improvement Act, which effectively descheduled hemp. And we'll be talking a lot more about hemp in some of these later slides. Cannabis throughout time has had a history of a lot of different uses, both from medicinal and food supplements, but also things like paper products, textiles, molded plastics, as well as construction materials. It's been used in a number of different areas, and this is why the hemp plant has been documented for so long, because we've been using it in this large number of ways. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on some of the scientific evidence, as well as the information about cannabis, really as it pertains to medicine. So if you were here for the livestock betting one, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to speak to that too much. So let's talk a little bit about the cannabis-based product categories. There are pharmaceutical formulations, which can be plant-derived or synthetic, and plant-derived and synthetic cannabinoids can often differ in their chemical composition, but can affect the body in similar ways. And we'll get into that as we start to talk about the targets that are found throughout the body. What's important to understand about a pharmaceutical preparation is that it is controlled by the Food and Drug Administration and has consistency and certain standards of purity, stability, safety, and efficacy. So a lot of the things that we know about drugs are done to sort of get that FDA approval. So clinical trials are done, safety trials are done in order to understand the full effects of a medication before it can be approved for use. Then you also have medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. So medical marijuana and recreational marijuana are really no different from each other, except for how you intend to use them. So medical marijuana is used by patients to treat a disease or alleviate symptoms of a disease by the patient's choice. However, just because it has medical in the front doesn't mean that there are those placebo-controlled randomized trials that test the efficacy and safety of these products. Recreational marijuana is the same marijuana that you could get if you were medical. However, you're just using it for things like euphoria or relaxation. So it's important to understand that even though something can say medical, it's not actually sort of held to a certain standard. And then finally, we have hemp. And hemp was what has been historically grown for its fibrous materials, like the stalks and the seeds. And this is what's been used in things like the textiles and paper. It contains minimal amounts of THC, which is a cannabinoid found in the cannabis plant. It can also be low in CBD, which is another cannabinoid found in the plant. And this is federally legal to grow. And then in 2018, like I said, hemp products became legal as well. So let's talk a little bit about cannabis and cannabinoids themselves. Cannabinoids can fall into three primary classes: the phytocannabinoids, the endocannabinoids, and the synthetic cannabinoids. So the phytocannabinoids were actually the first identified cannabinoids that scientists were able to uncover. And so because they are plant-based components found in the cannabis sativa plant, as well as other plants that may or may not function through the cannabinoid receptors. So scientists knew that the marijuana plant was actually impacting patients either when it was smoked or when it was ingested. They knew that there was some chemical compound that was interacting with the body that allowed it to have those effects. And that's the reason that we identified THC and CBD originally in the 1800s, because we knew that there was something happening, and so we did a lot of investigative work to find those things. After we discovered the phytocannabinoids and the cannabinoid receptors that they have their impact on, we discovered that there were already things in the body called endocannabinoids, which are chemicals that are produced by your body to impact your body, usually in neuromodulatory effects. So they have effects in things like homeostasis, which is your ability to balance your body's ability to balance itself when it's too hot or when it's hungry or when it's thirsty, as well as things like anxiety and depression. And then finally, we have things called synthetic cannabinoids, and these are artificially synthesized to mimic the effects or structure of endocannabinoids and phytocannabinoids. So again, you have phytocannabinoids from the plant, endocannabinoids, which come from your body, and then synthetic cannabinoids, which are made in the lab. So cannabis sativa L is the primary source of phytocannabinoids. While there are other plants that have phytocannabinoids in them, this is where we have found the majority of them. So cannabis is actually a single species of plant but it comes in a number of varieties. And so there are typically 3 historical varieties that we talk about, which you may have heard of before. You have sativa, indica, and ruderalis. We're not going to focus a lot on ruderalis because it typically is short, very low in cannabinoid content, and not very useful for a lot of the things that we find hemp or marijuana useful for. But sativa and indica are 2 varieties that most people will have heard about. So sativa has tall branch plants that's useful for cultivating fibers and seeds, or for psychoactive use. And then indica has short broadleaf plants, similar amounts of THC and CBD. But what's something that I learned since I joined Greenwich last year was that these plants are actually the same species. So there is really no difference, because after thousands of years of interbreeding from these historical varieties, the plants, while they may look different, don't actually differ in the chemical compound situation. They don't actually differ in the things that the plant produces. And so plant morphology is not indicative of the cannabinoid content or the chemical composition itself. Now let's go over a little bit more terminology. So we have cannabis sativa, which is the plant we just talked about. And under the legal terms from the hemp bill, you have hemp, or the farm bill, you have hemp, which is 0.3% THC or less, and then marijuana plants, which are anything above 0.3% THC by weight. And from a hemp plant, you can get things like hemp oil, that's coming from the seeds, but that does not have cannabinoids in it. But you can also get something that's called a full spectrum extract. And a full spectrum extract can come from the hemp or a marijuana plant and contain anything from cannabinoids like THC and CBD to things called terpenes, and a number of other products as well. You can also get a CBD isolate from the plant, and that's isolating the CBD cannabinoid from the full spectrum extract itself. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the terpenes and some of the other things that are found in the plant as well. So terpenes are what can be found in a number of other plants that cause a citrus smell. Terpenes are found in pine trees that cause the pine scent, and these are actually responsible for a lot of the smell and the taste of marijuana as well. Then there are also things like hydrocarbons, as well as alkaloids that are found in the plant, and we'll get into why the cannabis plant has that in a later slide. So now that we've talked a little bit about the cannabis plant, we've talked about cannabinoids, let's talk a little bit about how cannabinoids work in the body. Since I'm a pharmacist, the targets is sort of where my nerdiness lands, but I swear I'm going to try to keep you awake for the next 15 minutes or so. So there are identified cannabinoid receptors called the cannabinoid receptor 1 and the cannabinoid receptor 2. And let me tell you, every time I go, why is it 1 or 2? It's just literally, they discovered 1 first, and then they discovered 2. Scientists are not creative, guys. But what we know is that CB1 receptors are principally found at the presynaptic nerve terminals. And the presynaptic nerve terminals are when one nerve that's coming from the brain is connecting with another nerve that's coming either another part of the brain or somewhere else in the body. And so you have these 2 nerve terminals that are working together to transmit signals in one way or the other to help the body understand its surroundings, to help the body move its muscles, to blink, to breathe, things like that. And what it does is there's actually retrograde modulation of the release of inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters. That's a really fancy way of saying that cannabinoids, CB1 receptors are responsible for the transmission of nerve signals. And there's also CB2 receptors, which can often be found on immune active cells or in the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. CB2 receptors can often be expressed following nerve injury. So if something happens like a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, CB2 receptors can often be overexpressed in that area in order to help the body try to heal that area. And then it can also modulate cytokine release and cell migration, which are really important in inflammation as well as in immune targeting of things like viruses or bacteria in the body and how your body responds to external threats. So I want to focus a little bit more on the CB1 receptor. So let's talk about those pre and postsynaptic neurons a little bit more. So you can see on this screen here, so right there, the presynaptic neuron, which is basically where our signal is originating from, trying to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. And neurons do this by releasing a number of different neurotransmitters in the bodies, such as serotonin or GABA. And they either can increase the nervous system or decrease the nervous system, depending on what the role of the signal is. And what the CB1 receptor does is actually binds and modulates how those two neurons are communicating with one another. What we know is that THC specifically binds to CB1 receptors. So THC potently binds to those CB1 receptors in the CNS. And we think that that could be the reason why THC has the euphoric effects that it does. However, CBD has very poor affinity for CB1 receptors and lacks those euphoric effects. So THC, which is the main psychoactive compound, binds to these originally discovered CB1 receptors. And it actually turns out that CBD doesn't bind really well to CB2 receptors either. So if CBD doesn't bind to CB1 or CB2, where's its activity? We actually don't know exactly. So there are a number of different targets beyond CB1 and CB2 where we found that cannabinoids can actually work. So even though they're called the cannabinoid receptors, cannabinoids can work at a number of different places. And we actually don't know where a lot of the cannabinoids that we know about, which are over 100, where they can actually work. A couple of things that I want to highlight here and where these could be really important in the future. You have places like the monoamines. So places in the bottom here, the receptors looking at serotonin, and serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters which you're probably aware of, could be really useful in anxiety or depression. You also have things like the G protein coupled receptors, or the GPCRs, and those are really important in some of those immune modulatory effects, really recruiting white blood cells to the site of maybe a burn or a cut, or in inflammation. So it's identified to go along with CB2 in the gastrointestinal tract, and can actually be found to modulate the effects of inflammation in the GI tract as well. So there's a number of different ways that these are all kind of working together to create the effect of cannabinoids. And then my last one that I really like is the transient receptor potential channels, or the TRPV1. And the TRPV1 receptor was actually originally called the capsaicin receptor because it responded to capsicum, a chemical that is in hot peppers. And so if you were to rub a hot pepper on your skin, you'll feel heat. Or if you were to rub your hands together real fast, you feel that friction and that heat change there. That's actually the TRPV1 receptor telling your body that something in or around the skin is heating up. So cannabinoids can affect maybe how your body perceives temperature. All this to say, we don't really know a whole lot about how these cannabinoids are working, which is why it may have a broad therapeutic potential. There are 5 areas where the FDA has approved either a phytocannabinoid or a synthetic cannabinoid for use in a number of disease states. Obviously, it can be an anticonvulsant, which is what the Epilepsy Foundation works on the most. It can also be used as an antispasticity medication, as well as an analgesic or appetite stimulant, or an antiemetic. So there are a number of different therapeutic areas that have been sort of approved by the FDA. However, it's really important to know that because we don't know all of the targets and the receptors and how these cannabinoids are working, that we don't know every therapeutic area where there might be use. So now that I've talked a little bit about some of the regulation, the history, cannabinoids and their targets, I want to talk a little bit about what I consider practical considerations. So as you're considering using a cannabinoid product, making sure that you're talking with your physician maybe about these things, and there are a number of other things as well. So some of those consumer protection concerns are things like variability and stability, as well as the cannabis testing, drug-drug interactions, or contamination. I'm not going to talk about all of these today, but I want to talk about a few of them. So the first one I want to talk about is contamination. So the cannabis plant is what's called a phytoremediator. And a phytoremediator just basically means that these plants are really, really good at taking in external toxins or external chemicals from their outside environment, either in the air that the plant is using for, yep, I know this word, photosynthesis, or the soil that it's in as it uses its roots to grow. And it can absorb things like pesticides and chemical solvents, as well as heavy metals and radioactive compounds. So what's important to understand is that the marijuana plant, or the hemp plant, is taking in a lot of these chemicals and is actually growing them into its chemical structure itself. And so that's why you may have heard about mold or bacteria being taken into these plants and then being found later in a product, either maybe a flowering version of cannabis or a wax or an edible, that these were actually not kind of weeded out, to say, through the manufacturing process. And why this can be really important is that while 47 states allow for some medical cannabis, only 25 of those states have testing requirements. And then out of those, only 20% or only 20 of those test for content beyond those cannabinoids. So they're not testing for some of the compounds that can be brought into the plant from outside, or things like the terpenes or hydrocarbons that we talked about earlier. It's also not really clear whether every state has the resources to conduct and enforce that testing. And then it's also really important to know that many states exclude hemp products completely from testing because they know that they already have that low THC content. Another area that I want to talk about today is potential mislabeling. So THC and CBD are often labeled, and what some data has shown is that this is not always accurate. In recent years, the FDA has sent nearly 100 warning letters regarding separate CBD products. These mostly were found under the inaccurate labeling of THC and CBD content itself, or unfounded or false medical claims. Basically, when a company says that something can be used for a medical condition, but they don't have the scientific research to back it up. Cannabidiol extracts may be inaccurately labeled. Like I said, and like the FDA has found, a number of different products have been tested to see if the CBD and THC content is accurate compared to what the label says. And so when you're looking at CBD oil, CBD tinctures, and vaporization liquid, when you look in the green here, what they found is that most products were actually labeled inaccurately. And that was if the CBD content was 10% higher or lower than the labeled value. 70% of those products were actually labeled inaccurately for CBD, and 20% of them, even though they said they did not contain any THC, actually did. Due to the variability of CBD and THC content, the authors of this study concluded that they should be avoided for pediatric patients. And then finally, one of the questions that I think is really important to ask is, if something is mislabeled, or even if it could be accurately labeled, can that CBD product itself get you high? So according to a recent study from Johns Hopkins University, a marijuana-infused brownie containing 10 milligrams of THC can result in intoxicating effects in adults. So what's important to understand is hemp is labeled as anything that falls below 0.3% THC. And what that is, and how we measure that, is you basically weigh something out, and then 0.3% of that has to be less, 0.3% of that or less can be THC. But the way that that works is that a 30 milliliter bottle of CBD oil could actually contain 81 milligrams of THC and still fall below 0.3%. A single 4-gram CBD gummy can have 12 milligrams of THC, which, according to the Johns Hopkins University study, could be equal to a full dose. There's also dispensary products, which I don't know why I left Oregon as my state. I should have picked Colorado. But in Oregon, the 5 milligram THC per serving, or a 50 milligram THC per product, but you can always have more than one serving. And then finally, an RX for a synthetic THC is 2.5 milligrams. So the 81 milligrams that can be found in that 30 milliliter bottle of CBD oil could actually contain the equivalent of 32 doses of a prescription product. So I think that this is really important to think about as you're looking at product labels, potentially for use for any disease state, that some of the labeling could be incorrect. So it's really important to do a lot of research and to talk to your physician about what products might be best for you. And then finally, I want to talk about drug-drug interactions and adverse event reporting. These can be really important to understand, especially because they tie so closely with pharmaceutical products and our ability to understand the safety for each individual patient. There is this idea that CBD has no side effects. CBD adverse events or cannabidiol adverse events on the National Library of Medicine, there was a search that was conducted, and they actually found 148 different peer-reviewed publications about safety and efficacy or safety of CBD. a number of different trials have found a lot of different side effects that can be present either in oral cannabis extracts as well as CBD products themselves. So we know that things like anxiety or weight gain, in some cases, nausea or increased appetite or irritability, a lot of things like somnolence or fatigue, as well as GI symptoms have all been found for CBD products. So thinking that just because you're getting it off of the shelf, maybe at your pharmacy, it doesn't mean that it's a safe product to use. And then cannabis also has a number of metabolic interactions. And basically what this means is metabolics is how your body processes either drugs or food or toxins that may enter the body and how the body eliminates it. So your body has two enzyme classes that are known as the CYP or the UGT, and these are responsible for the majority of the processing of drugs and other toxins as they enter your body. And what we found is that CBD, THC, and a THC analog all had impact on these metabolic enzymes, which could impact the way that drugs are processed through your body, either increasing the amount that's in the bloodstream, decreasing the amount that's in the bloodstream, or making your body absorb it slower or get it or eliminate it faster from your system. So it can be really important to make sure that you're talking with your physician about how these drugs could interact with the things that you're already taking. So in conclusion, we talked about a little bit of the history dating back more than 5,000 years. We talked about some of the 20th century regulations that have limited the use of cannabis for research and its use in medicine. There are three classes of pharmacologically active cannabinoids: the endocannabinoids, the phytocannabinoids, and the synthetic cannabinoids. Then we also have the receptors cannabinoid receptor 1 and 2 that have been well studied, while new receptors have been identified, such as those TRP channels or the GRP55. And then current scientific discovery is uncovering a lot of different potential therapeutic uses for them. But clinical research is absolutely crucial to understand those possible drug-drug interactions like I talked about, the dosing, as well as that efficacy and safety. And with that, I will start to take questions and stop sharing my screen.